Kia ora tātou, shalom, salam, namaste, talofa lava, warm greetings. I'm Jocelyn Armstrong, co-chair of the Religious Diversity Centre. In this critical time for our planet, the Centre, the RDC, has a climate action work group. This year's program is titled E Tu Mana o Te Ao, Building a Climate of Hope. And one member of the contributing to that climate of hope is Rod Oram, whose care for the environment is deeply centred in his Christian faith. Rod is a New Zealand journalist and Newsroom Weekly columnist. He covers business, economics and politics, and at the moment, right now, he's in Egypt to cover the United Nations COP27 Climate Change Conference in the city of Sharm el-Sheikh. Rod attended COP26 last year and reported back to us from Glasgow, and he's agreed to do so again today from Egypt. Welcome, Rod, to our screen. And I'm now pleased to invite the RDC Climate Action Work Group convener, Dr. Paul Blaschke, to interview Rod. Paul is an environmental consultant with a background in ecology and environmental policy work. He's a Jewish member of the RDC Climate Action Work Group. Paul, I know you have your questions for Rod. Over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jocelyn, and I sure do have some questions. Kia ora, Rod. Tēnā koutou katoa to all our listeners, and a special greeting to you and a big thanks for attending in your busy time in Egypt, at Sharm el-Sheikh, and I know that it hasn't been plain sailing to get to Egypt and to be there. So really appreciate your time and your effort to talk with us and perhaps give us a slightly different angle from some of the great news reports we're getting from you and other commentators here in the media in Aotearoa. So I've got quite a few questions lined up. We'll have to move through them fairly quickly, but I'm just going to start off with something a little bit more general. So I think some general impressions from you about this particular COP meeting. What's distinctive about this meeting as it's winding through? I think it's 3/4 of the way through now, and in the setting, which I understand is only the second COP meeting to be held in a Muslim country.
Yes, kia ora tātou, and to Paul and everyone, it's a great pleasure to be on the line with you. It's only 8 o'clock in the morning, but getting slightly warm, and there's a few flies around. So if I start doing an Australian wave through this, you'll know what's going on. And it's quite dry, so I'll probably be drinking a lot. Indeed, this is the second time that it's been hosted in a Muslim country, but also an African country. Marrakesh, in fact, has hosted 2 previous COPs, going back about 10 years, as memory serves, and about 7 or 8 years. And this is a very important COP because here in Egypt, Egypt, of course, considers itself very much part of the Middle East, very much part of Africa. And so this has been very much considered the African COP, which is hugely important because whilst the population of the whole extraordinary continent of Africa is only about 1.2 billion people at the moment, over coming decades, this is where all the fastest growth in population, economy and emissions is going to be. And therefore, it's really important for the world to come around Africa and support them to take a big leap forward, so they don't go through old stages of fossil fuels and everything else to get to climate compatible economies and societies, that they leapfrog. And they have experience in this. So, for example, with phones, many countries had pretty dire landline phone systems, but when mobile phones came along, they leapt straight to that and became great pioneers in payments by mobile phones and things like that. So there's a huge excitement here about that. So that does make this COP different. And of course, each COP is very much influenced by the mood of the time. And of course, given the climate catastrophes that are escalating, particularly over this past year, and all the geopolitics and everything else around that, that's very intense here. But it also reflects the host country, both in location and the style of the host government, which is Egypt, which of course is an autocratic government. And so it's been far harder for civil society to play a role here. So NGOs and the like, who are terribly important, because if you think very crudely in terms of governments and business and civil society, these three great actors in all this have to work together. And it's civil society that keeps the feet to the fire of both business and government. So that's been marked here. And there has been, talking to lots of NGO people, they do feel those pressures. Some of them are self-imposed, but all the same, they do feel constrained. Then furthermore, the pace of this COP is a lot slower than Glasgow. And there are fewer decisions, there are fewer announcements being made, there are fewer decisions, there's far more unresolved issues have come through into this second week for the political leaders to try to resolve. And so it feels a very different COP, and that's just my perspective on two. But talking to veterans of far more COPs, those are the sort of themes they're highlighting. And so at this time of these ever greater climate emergency, that's not translating here in terms yet. We might, in terms of big new commitments, trying to fast forward things. Having said that, the classic arc of COP is that you've got this kind of all the way through the first, lots of preliminary stuff, then all the way through the first week. And then it's not really until you get into the second half of the last week, the second week, that's where negotiations get very intense. So hopefully we'll see now, it's only Wednesday morning here. By the time we get to the official close on Friday, which we won't meet, the COP will run on for at least a day or so afterwards. That's where, I hate to use the analogy or the language, but people start banging heads together in a more constructive way. That's a mixed metaphor, if ever I've heard one.
Great. Well, thank you for painting that picture, which I can imagine is quite a frustrating one in many ways. So, just moving to some more issues, specific issues, and I will just add. Before I do that some of my questions are generated myself and from the news reports I've heard. I've actually discussed a couple of them with Rod ahead of time, but I've also got some questions from some of my younger friends, people in their 20s, and I'll be peppering those through through our discussion, Rod, in no particular order, because it is so important to have their concerns, which I am finding are certainly different from mine. So I want to start with something that you've already mentioned, and that's the presence of civil society and NGOs here at this COP. So you've given us an overall impression of a lesser visibility and a lesser presence. A couple of specific aspects that I'm wondering about. Do you actually have restrictions on participation for the NGOs and civil society groups? Are there faith groups represented, where I know there was a very strong faith group representation in Glasgow? And first question from my younger correspondents, how many people there are under the age of 45, which I think is a very generous definition of a young person? But particularly in the actual delegations of the countries, are those delegations old people's delegations?
No, I'll deal with the age one first, because I think it's terrifically important. I was struck by this last year in Glasgow. that the median age of delegates, both in negotiations, in political roles, but also in business and in civil society, was young. And I didn't manage to get a median age out of the UN on that. But that's certainly true here as well. And you do see a few old hands around, particularly in the most senior political leaders, i.e. the climate ministers or the heads of state. But then, of course, there are still some quite young heads of state have been turning up here as well. But it is very much people who are, say, under 45, who have the energy, the creativity, but also I feel a greater ability to try to build coalitions, find unlikely partners to try to progress things. And I feel that my sense is that people are always scanning as to who can I find, who can I help, who could help me. And I find that sort of spirit of COP a very exciting one. So yes, there's a lot of younger people, and then that comes right down, particularly through the NGOs. So from New Zealand, Rhiannon Mackie is here as a delegate, working with the New Zealand branch of Climate Action Network, which is a global organization. And I think Rhiannon is only just about 18. I'm not sure whether she's still in school or has finished school. And she's very impressive. It was interesting having a good long chat with her the other day. So yes, a big thumbs up to all those people far younger than the three of us on this screen.
Faith groups and restrictions.
Yep. The restrictions, as far as I've heard, are not overt. There are lots of stories of difficulties in getting badges, i.e. getting registration. Then strange things do happen. Very interesting stories that when people are huddled together and it looks as though there's an interesting conversation going on, say, between NGO people, what cleaners or people wearing cleaners uniforms drift towards them and are eavesdropping. No, seriously, and I don't think this is sort of a paranoia. I am puzzled that I can't get through to newsroom from here. I can on my phone, but not on my laptop. I thought it was my computer, but a number of other people here have told me they can't access newsroom either. And I'm following that up today with the tech people in the media center. So maybe we're just so we're not paranoid. There is more control here. There's no two ways about that. Faith groups, yes. I'm afraid I'm nowhere near as well plugged into all of that here as I was last year. But for example, a very good interfaith group representing all the main religions has been holding a press conference every morning, usually at 10:30 in one of the main press conference rooms for half an hour. Everybody only gets a half-hour slot with a big topic of the day. They have been very articulate and around all the themes that we know so well in the RDC about the role of faith in this. Very interestingly, being a Muslim country, you will find individuals, you will find small groups of people in not so quiet corners, because there aren't those there, praying to Mecca at various times of the day. People obviously are respectful of that and just sort of walk around them. But it's quite fascinating to see that. I mean, I know it's completely every day. It's part of people's life and faith. But it's really, I'd have to say, heartwarming that to see amidst all the hurly-burly of COP, people are taking those precious moments through the day to pause and reflect and to pray. And I feel we should all take a lead from them on that.
That's good. And just going back to what you mentioned about for the faith group's press conference on the theme of the day, I just wondered if you noticed different themes coming from the civil society and NGO discussions that you've been in that are not being dealt with in the mainstream and not being reported. We're getting quite a lot of news back here in Aotearoa, but maybe some of the things that you're hearing on the ground coming from NGOs and civil society are not quite so visible.
Yes, indeed. There's obviously a vast array of issues in play here, and for every issue, there's lots of NGOs involved, and all the very big ones are being well reported, not the least of which being finance for developing countries for loss and damage caused by climate, which they have managed to get onto the agenda officially for the first time ever in this COP. And that was a big breakthrough. It took them 40 hours of discussions and negotiations before COP started, in the days before COP, to get that onto the agenda. So those big issues are covered. But I'll just give you one example that I was spending some time on yesterday. I spent some time with the indigenous peoples of the world. There's an indigenous peoples international climate change forum, and a terrific young New Zealand climate activist, Caden Watts, is who's working with them here, and just a terrific bunch of people with from indigenous people from around the world. And whilst indigenous knowledge has been taking a bigger role as gaining more prominence in reports from the United Nations. So, for example, the most recent biggest assessment report, AR6, had whole chapters on indigenous knowledge. That's not flowing through, as far as I can tell, into sort of mainstream negotiations. They're still very much pushing very much for their rights and protections. And that's terribly important everywhere, but it's really important in Africa because the oil and gas industry is seeing Africa as a new frontier. And there's already a lot of production here. Nigeria, a huge oil producer. But there is vast exploration going on, and in very sensitive areas like the Congo Basin rainforest. It's indigenous people there who don't have basic rights. I saw a poster yesterday about consultation is not permission. And so there's sort of scant at best consultation, and then people bowl in and take over their lands. So yes, there's lots of themes like that are far from elevated and really brought into the heart of the negotiations.
And I do want to talk now about one of the major ones that you've mentioned, and that's the financing aspects and the loss and damage, and perhaps tease out some of the sort of social justice and climate justice issues behind those two important issues. I think just by way of background, it would be good if you just started off to our listeners. Some of you will not know exactly what's meant by this rather mechanistic phrase, loss and damage. Just give us a very brief scoping of what is meant by loss and damage and why it is so important.
Yes. Obviously, climate impacts are very real and they're accelerating. And so they are causing damage to all countries, not just developing countries. So that's the damage part, is the actual physical damage. But the loss side is the economic one. And already from the changing climate and already the cost of repairing that damage. The economic loss from the changing climate is very significant. So there was a big report out from the V20 group of countries, the vulnerable 20 originally. There's now about 65 of them in that group. And a very, very good economic analysis showing that there are many countries that have already lost about 20% of their economic potential and ability to earn even the meager income they do, because of the shifting climate. And then there's the costs of repair, and then there's the costs of adapting and making their economies climate resilient. So there's no hard number on what that might be, needless to say, but there was, as a preliminary to COP, a high-level UN working group on this. Lord Stern, the British climate economist, former head of the UK Treasury, famous for his Stern report on climate economics back, oh crikey, about 12, 13 years ago, was a member of that. And he's saying, realistically, it's at least $2 trillion a year is going to be needed by about 2030. So that's the scale of the money. So the issue then is, how do richer countries help meet that burden? But also, how do we get private capital flowing and philanthropic money flowing into that as well? So this requires some very different kinds of mechanisms, and there are discussions about those new mechanisms here. The very best that we can hope for by the end of this is that a commitment that by the end of 2024, there will be some idea of a structure. And then after that, it's going to take time to work out how to operationalize that, how to get money flowing through it. So there is huge frustration here about that very substantial timeframe. On top of that, a number of developed countries, the US in particular, has made it very clear that they refuse to be held responsible for all the emissions they've already put up in the atmosphere that are causing the climate change. They are refusing to accept liability for that, and they're refusing the idea of any kind of reparations for that. So the only way they will proceed is on the basis is, from the goodness of our heart, here's some new money. It's not reparations, we're not admitting liability, but here's some new money. And on a positive side, though, there are some really creative structures going on here. The one that I think is most fascinating is called the Bridgetown Initiative. And this was the idea from the very wonderful Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and Bridgetown being the capital. And she got a big working party together, also including Lord Stern and lots of other people of that caliber, in Bridgetown earlier this year, to start to map out how could you change the purposes of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and their finances to help catalyze this flow of private sector money. There is a wonderfully important historic parallel here, because the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in the US in 1944, and as the Allies saw a way to victory, was talking about rebuilding the world after and creating new structures, of which the IMF and the World Bank were the two key ones. And we can be very cynical about some of the things that those two organizations have done since, but the basic concept is still a really important one. Of countries pooling resources to then apply them in an equitable and logical fashion. And so I think that's a very important thing to look at.
Well, money is important, and I think that your comments have really shown that there is a very important sort of ethical dimension to a lot of this discussion. And I was going to ask about the framing of these loss and damage comments, but I think you've already hinted at the dimensions that, it's not just an economic compensation thing, that there are also overtones about liability. So there's a lot of legal argument going on, and so on. So I can certainly see the connection with some of the social justice themes that civil society and people in poorer countries and vulnerable countries are going on about. There was just one thing I'd heard of this Bridgetown Fund, and that's really interesting. Thanks for that introduction. Another, I guess, type of mechanism or pathway in terms of financing and loss and damage is the idea, the concept of paying for development, rich countries paying for development in poorer countries, economic development, but economic development that is not as tightly coupled to emissions growth as it has been historically in the rich countries. So that might be, for example, setting up renewable and financing renewable energy generation facilities so that electricity can be produced from non-fossil sources to power things like EVs instead of fossil fuel cars. And you gave us a great example with the cell phone technology where this leapfrogging is possible. So has there been a lot of discussion about those sorts of pathways affecting energy development in particular?
Yes. So, for example, just yesterday, Egypt, as the host, launched a big new program around that for Africa, which looks very promising. There is a really crucial aspect of this that sheets right back home to us in Aotearoa, which does not get enough discussion globally, and next to none in New Zealand. And this is the concept of a developed country meeting its Paris commitments, its NDCs, in part by investing in developing countries. So you're not reducing your own emissions, you do something in another country, and they are do something low emission or no emission, but you get the credit for that, not them. And I think there is a basic piece of logic that we have to hold on to here. Several big pieces of logic. The first one is humanity is right up against the limits on emissions. So we've all got to reduce emissions as fast as we possibly can. So we in New Zealand have to reduce our emissions. We can't just say, well, we'll let somebody up in the Pacific not create more emissions or slightly reduce theirs. So that's the first thing. The second one is that, yes, of course, we need to spend money on making our economies climate compatible, climate resilient, zero emissions. But we've also got to find the money to help developing countries do that, because if we don't, they will become complete disasters, not just in humanitarian terms, but become even greater contributors to the climate crisis. So we've got to do both. And it feels to me that this idea of meeting your obligations in another country is a deeply flawed compromise. And the worst case scenario that our Climate Change Commission and government is forecasting is that if we don't do, even if we do all the things they map out we could do, we will still be making very substantial purchases of emissions reductions elsewhere. The only other country that is very big on this is Switzerland. It's further ahead than us in many ways because it's developed a number of bilateral programs with, I think, about 6 or 8 countries, which I think, I haven't looked at them closely, but I understand there's a lot of rigor in them to make sure that what the 2 countries are planning to do happens and has the right benefit for the climate. As far as I know, we're not yet in a position in New Zealand where we have secured such agreements. So to me, this is a really problematic area, and I don't think it gets anywhere near enough attention, as I say, here or international discussions, or particularly back home in Aotearoa.
Thanks. There's some really big issues there that you've touched on and discussed, and we could continue on that, but I won't. I'll just move to another quite big issue. It's particularly relevant to our vulnerable Pacific nations, and that is the theme about relocation of communities and climate migration in response to climate change effects. rising sea levels, but also flooding, etc. I just want to get a quick impression of how prominent has that theme been, and has it been particularly oriented towards specific countries, or has it also been discussed in relation to other countries?
I know that it's very much an issue that is sort of in the works. There's this huge array of working parties and the like. I'm afraid it's an issue, and I feel very badly for saying this, particularly with deep respect for our Pacific neighbours. I just haven't been following close enough. So I'm afraid I just can't give you a feel on that at all.
Okay. It's certainly something that is coming up here in Aotearoa that we're hearing about. And I think some of the Pacific countries, including the delegations, the official delegations, as well as the NGOs, are talking about that. But we can pursue that at a later time. We haven't got too long to go, I think about 10 minutes. And I do want to come to some of the questions which I have touched on earlier from my, shall I call them my younger correspondents. And I'll start with a really brief and chunky question. Has the world given up on the 1.5 degree warming target in reality? This is certainly a concern of some of my younger friends.
I don't know how to answer that, because there are deeply impassioned pleas not the least of which yesterday from Alok Sharma, the British politician who was president of COP last year. It is a big tussle in the final document as that's starting to be constructed. There are a few countries who are saying actually the Paris Agreement says 2 degrees and we should stick to that. 1.5 was only an aspiration. Those countries are Saudi Arabia, for example, and other fossil fuel producers. What I'm hearing is that my sense of the meeting is that it is the consensus is still to push for well below 2, as Paris said, and 1.5, just the sheer reality of how much emissions would have to be reduced by 2030 by about 45% globally, and we're already at almost the end of 2022, just seems utterly impossible. I think a different way of looking at it, or a more helpful way of looking at it is again, Sharma said this yesterday, that every fraction of a degree counts. So there is climate impact for every fraction of a degree. So it has to be this monumental effort to scale up enormously what we do, so we can get as close as possible to 1.5. There ain't no way that this COP is going to say we are going to do 1.5, because politicians might be tempted to make claims they know they have no chance of fulfilling. On the current trajectory, that's one they can't. But I can't emphasize enough the importance for us all to keep that number absolutely right in front of us as we progress our own work, to know that's how urgent it all is. That's how hard we have to work. That's how creative, how constructive we have to be. And just keep saying 1.5, because we've got to get as close as we possibly can to it.
Sure. And here's a related question. I have seen some calculations that have looked at all the different country targets and corporate targets for getting to net zero emissions. And perhaps that net zero emissions is a giveaway too. And yet that will be adequate to get us to that 1.5 degree warming target. And yet we know that we're way, way behind it. So are you getting a discussion of and scrutiny of these targets, these net zero targets, as to whether they're real or whether they're greenwashing?
There was a very important, again, a high-level UN working group, of which the chair of our climate change commission, Rod Carr, was a member of, are on greenwashing. And there are, it sounds terribly mechanistic, but there are 10 principles there, but and a whole bunch of other stuff. It's a very good paper. And my colleague, Mark Dolder, on Newsroom, wrote very well about that at the beginning of the week, last week. And it's well worth reading that piece. It helps, but there is still an awful lot of greenwashing. And for many of us, the argument has moved on from net zero because the actual task has to be reducing emissions, not offsetting them in some way. And so in that there is capacity from trees to absorb carbon, we need that capacity and all the new trees we can plant to actually absorb the carbon that's in the atmosphere now, to bring it back down to more manageable levels, not to offset new emissions. And so we have to fight the net concept very hard and concede that there's a tiny, hopefully only a tiny last bit of emissions that need to be offset. But we can't just use net as a crutch, an excuse for not reducing emissions. And that debate livens up a bit. But going back to, and there's a lot of scrutiny of countries' NDCs, there's no two ways about that. But even in the very best scenario, if countries delivered all of the things they're pledging, even, which is a ridiculous if, it would still be about 1.8. And realistically, current policies are still tracking more like, and delivery is still tracking more like 2.
Or even more, yeah. And in that regard, Rod, has there been a lot of scrutiny of New Zealand's targets and New Zealand's performance?
No. New Zealand has an unbelievably low profile here. There are very simple ways of measuring that. So, for example, there is a wonderful Canadian NGO that for many years has been officially allowed to be inside meetings and to report on them, to help give a record of meetings and negotiations. Obviously, some of the sensitive political ones they don't get into. So the daily bulletin for that is a very dense document. And I do a word search every day on New Zealand, and there's hardly any reference at all.
Well, that gives us some perspective on how we feature. Look, I'm going to finish with a couple more questions from younger people close to me, and these are actually surprisingly introspective questions, but they really go to the heart of some of the ethical and moral issues that we're thinking about. One question was, why actually is there an annual COP conference with thousands of delegates traveling tens of hundreds of thousands of air kilometers? Is it really worth it for that sense of getting together? Do they actually lead to any climate outcomes that are better than having a few Zoom meetings? Also related to this, in my correspondence, you then went on to sort of ask about, well, what's the role of personal responsibility? You know, why should I be choosing not to travel or to have a low emissions diet when there are all these other huge emitters going on? Is there any degree of introspection at these COP conferences, I guess, is what we're getting at?
Yes, there is. And I know from the conversations I have here, the people who come as delegates in their government, in business, in NGOs, the vast majority of them are deeply committed, and personally, that's what keeps them going. I just feel it's such a core principle that humanity, each of us, has to take responsibility for our own emissions. Each of us has to do what we can. Now, we can only, each of us, do this infinitesimally tiny thing. But if kind of like an infinite number of us, well, 8 billion of us, did our infinitesimally small thing, then we've solved the problem. So I know that's a kind of a facile thing to say, but we do have to take personal responsibility. And I know I flew here and I take responsibility for that. And the only thing I can do about that is to buy offsets, which in this case is in the Pacific. And you've heard my views on offsets, and here I am buying them, but that's the only thing I can do.
That's right.
But the benefit of being here is substantial. And I just want to tell you one story, because, and I'm going to get quite emotional about this. I was on the bus back from COP 3 or 4 days ago and was chatting to the person sitting next to me. He's called George from Kenya. And George had about 2 decades in the national parliament in Nairobi. But late in his career, he decided to focus instead on his local community. Because, of course, in Africa, they don't have the sort of governmental structures that we have in developed countries. An awful lot more falls to the role of local communities. So he is an elected official in charge of a county, as he called it, obviously a holdover from colonial times, of 1.2 million people on the shores of Lake Victoria. Well, thanks to the climate, the water level of Lake Victoria has risen 2 meters because of huge rains in the hills behind. But there is a huge drought in the 20 or 30 kilometers running from the lake back to the hills. And pastoral farmers are, there's areas that have had no rain for 3 years. Pastoral farmers are rapidly losing all their animals and all the rest. So they got all this water in the lake, but they can't get it onto the fields in this drought. And so he had come to COP just to try to look for answers and look for things he can take back to his community. And you can say, well, how could you possibly find that at COP? Well, aside from the negotiations, there's this huge hooey of humanity in the civil society side of COP. And there's NGOs, there's organizations, there's science groups, having very detailed programs every day of very practical things. And I should have taken George's phone number. I would love to catch up with him afterwards. I'm going to track him down. There can't be too many counties with 1.2 million people around Lake Victoria. I'm sure I can find him because I want to know what he's found. And that's why people come together. And it's only when you stare each other in the face and you hear each other's stories. And it doesn't work on Zoom. You can have an impassioned Zoom meeting, but we know that's not the same as being there in person. There are still, my taxi driver from the airport when I arrived, who spoke very good English, told me there are still 6 flights a day from Moscow with tourists.
Thank you, Rod. Thank you.
You just work that out. But anyway, I digress. But that's, there's 45,000 people here. There will be a proportion who don't do much, don't get much out of it. But being here matters.
Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you, Rod, to finish with that story. And I can see how you have been touched by such stories and meetings at the conference. Thank you, Paul, for your questions and carrying the interview through.
And Rod, thank you from me personally to Rod as well. Thank you, Rod.
Good. The words that stick with me are monumental effort. Not only a monumental effort at government level, but a monumental effort at personal level. And your mention of the Muslims praying during the day stays with me. I think our actions and our prayers for our planet at this point. So thank you, Rod, and please travel safely home.
Will do.
Yes. Thank you.